All right, thanks, Wendy, and a good afternoon to everyone. I'm Tony Bergantino, Director of the Water Resources Data System in the Wyoming State Climate Office. And thanks to all of you for joining us in the February conditions briefing. This is put on each month by the usual cast of characters, including my office, University of Wyoming Extension with USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub, the U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. We have the National Weather Service office in Riverton today, and the National Weather Service Missouri River Basin Forecast Center as well. So today we'll take a look at climate, drought conditions, stream flow, reservoir ops, forecasts and outlooks, including water supply. And then for our highlight of the month, we'll get a brief look at the coalitions and collaboratives post-wildfire efforts. So starting with the latest drought monitor map, hot off the presses this morning and going through Tuesday the 18th. A lot of green areas on the map now, signifying areas that saw improvement from the last webinar. Recent snows have helped conditions considerably and brought many of the basins up to and even exceeding median snowpack. We did have one small area of degradation in the far southwest, that red polygon right at the Utah border there on the Lincoln-Uinta County line. But even with the improvements, though, the current map on the right shows most of areas of Wyoming having drought conditions that are worse than what we had last year over here on the left. However, unlike last month, where there was only a small area down in the south central part of Wyoming that was better off than last year, you can see that the panhandle of Park County, it's ever been called that, is now better than in 2024. The northern Bighorns are a bit better now than a year ago. And an area of Campbell, Crook counties is also one category better. Unfortunately, there are areas of those same two counties that are also 2 and 3 categories worse now than they were a year ago too. So it does cut both ways. Quarter century of drought in Wyoming. We now have a little over 81.5% of the state in drought. That is D1 through D4, or moderate drought through exceptional. Or rather D3 now, since we don't have any of the exceptional drought at the moment. This is down almost 5.25% from the last webinar. And when you add in that D0 or abnormally dry condition, the percentage jumps way back up there to 98.17% of Wyoming affected. But that's at least down almost 1.8% from the last time we met, when 100% of the state was in D0 through D4. Zooming in on the last 5 years, which somewhat gives a sense of this drought episode compared to the 2020 to 2023 one, we get a more detailed look at things at this view. You can see that bit of white space up in the upper right corner of the chart there, showing the area of the state that has no D category at all. That increased little bit here in the last few weeks. You can also see the steady decline in moderate, severe, and extreme drought since about the start of the year, although we do still have just over 17.7% of the state in D3 or extreme drought. That's a decrease from the last webinar, though, by a hair over 8% or so. Precipitation over the last 2 weeks has been fairly good, except for the center of the state and extending up there into Campbell and Crook counties. Most of the west and south is over the 80th percentile, while the southern Bighorns are at the opposite end, having received, they're under the 10th percentile up there. So how does it look for the last 3 months? The west, northwest, southern Carbon County, Albany counties are at to above median, while the other areas of the lower elevation east, along with the southern Bighorn Basin, below median. With some scattered, moderate-sized areas of it being under the 10th percentile. That's those red and dark red areas that you see there. Here we have the comparison of the water year, calendar year precipitation totals as a percent of normal. On the left here is the water year, and that sort of diagonal swatch of above normal precipitation that we've been seeing the last few webinars is still present, but it's a little bit losing its diagonal shape. Southeast is the most below normal, with percentages there being under 70% in Goshen and Platte counties, along with much of Laramie County, Albany, Converse, Niobrara counties. Over here on the right is precipitation since the start of the calendar year, so about last 50 or so days. We see much of the west and south, along with the far north, at above to well above normal, thanks to the snows that we've been seeing lately. Large area of the Eastern Plains still below normal for the calendar year, although along with some areas over there in central Sweetwater County as well. Standardized precipitation map, or the SPI, shows conditions for 30 and 60 days at the top left and right, and then a full year down here on the lower right. At the 30 and 60-day time frames, the wetness in the west and south is fairly consistent, though a bit more pronounced in the 30-day depiction, indicating a wettening of conditions there. Central Wyoming, however, shows a bit more of a dryness in the 30-day than in the 60, indicating a worsening rather of conditions there. And then looking down here on the lower right at the 1-year representation, only a little bit of blue or wetness showing up, hardly worth mentioning. The east does stand out for a long-term dryness extending up into the eastern side of the Bighorns, and then across central Wyoming there. Comparing this time frame to the 30-day and 60-day indicates a more recent improvement of conditions in the west and south, but enforces that deterioration in the central part of Wyoming. Looking over at temperatures, on the upper left, we have the low temperatures. It's over the last 2 weeks. And Bighorn Basin has been the cool spot, with temperatures there up to and exceeding 10 degrees below normal, or 10 degrees actual temperature, actually. South central part of the state has the warmest nighttime temperatures, only getting down to a little over 10 above in many places. Departures from normal down here on the lower left. Well, northern, almost 2/3 of the state has been about 10 degrees below normal, except for the Teton and Lincoln County, as well as the southwest side of the Wind River Range. East of the Laramie Range has been the same story, with the same greater than -10 departure. From the western side of the Laramie Range, going westward over to the Utah border, departures have been about normal to as much as 2 degrees below normal, with the far southwest being some areas over there 4 to 5 degrees below normal. There's been a very anomalous blob in northern western Albany, northeastern Carbon County, where temperatures have been about 10 degrees above normal, and looking into seeing what's causing that to show up. The 14-day high temperatures, daytime highs, go in reverse in this on this set here. I'll start with the departures down on the lower left and just say that it's almost very, very similar to story to what we just saw in the minimum temperatures as far as the areas covered. The departures themselves, however, been even greater on the negative side, with only a few areas that saw above normal high temperatures. Actually, I don't see any of them on there. The rest has been 2 to 5 degrees below normal in the south central part of the state, and about 10 or so above for the remainder. On the upper right are the actual temperatures again, and the northern half of the state has been cool, while the southern part has been, well, relatively warm. Daytime highs over the last week in the teens and lower in the northern third, while the southern half to 2/3 or so of Wyoming has been in the mid-20s to mid-30s, with the upper green and the mountainous regions of that area being the colder spots. Soil moisture improved over the last 2 weeks in the west and northwestern areas. Much of the rest of the state has stayed within that same percentile band that it was 2 weeks ago, but we've seen some declines in east central Wyoming, along with the area of eastern Sweetwater and southeastern Fremont counties. Those areas now that are 0 to 2%, or at the 0 to 2nd percentile, when they were originally in the up to the 5th percentile. So we have seen some degradations there. Snowpack. Currently, that large map here on the left. Part of the state, especially the northeastern, and 80 to 90% of median. Rest of the state being above 90%, except South Platte down here is our constant low performer, it seems, at 56% of median. We have 10 of the basins now that are at or above median, with the green, both the upper and lower green, and Sweetwater Basin there in the center part of the state being the highest, all at 113% of median. Looking at the smaller map on the right shows where the basins were on the state last year, and at first glance, things are generally doing better this year. Second glance kind of says the same thing, but if you look at it again, there are two basins. You got the Upper Bear and the Little Snake, which had higher snowpack amounts last year, but I hasten to point out that that is only by what, 2% in the Bear and 1% in the Little Snake. So very, very much about the same. Look at modeled snowpack. Here we are looking across the state. Again, these are gridded data as opposed to the last map, which showed one number per basin based upon the snow-tail sites in the area. Northern Plains, Northern Bighorn Basin are setting at well above median, although remember that's not mountain snowpack up there, so it comes and goes and can change fairly quickly. Mountainous areas are seeing a mix of above median and below median. However, when we compare to last year, you can see a lot of green, blue, and purple colors there, indicating snowpack that's higher this year than last. This is taken just by subtracting last year's snowpack from this year. So if you have a positive number, we're doing better now than we were then. Unfortunately, there are scattered yellow, orange, and red locations indicating areas that are worse now compared to last year, especially down here in the Southwest. So now that we're well into February and have some more meaningful percentages, I want to again highlight this table, which shows the current water year and the status of the basins on their march toward peak snow water equivalent, really. The table gives the date of this peak snow water equivalent so far this year, and in most cases, here we're currently at or within a day of having had that peak. And it also gives what the current peak is, how early or late it would be if you assume that it ended up to be the peak for this year, which isn't likely now. But then we see how high or low that peak is from the median and what the percentage of the median peak it would be. Those last three columns give stats of what the median peak date is, what the snow water equivalent is for each basin at the median peak, and then when meltdown usually occurs. I've highlighted here three of the basins here in the sixth column. The ones in red, the lower North Platte and the Powder River Basin, have had peaks that are currently at 50% of the median seasonal peak. Well, of course, except for the South Platte, which is usually that low shower. These two are the lowest in the state in terms of percent of median peak snowpack. The one in green highlighted there is the Snake River Basin, which has had a peak so far that's 83% of the median peak for the year. We're only 2/3 into February though, so these numbers will improve, but invite you to keep track down here at the URL on the lower left and just sort of watch how this changes through the days and weeks. So now if you click on any of those IMG or image tags here, you get a rough, you get a graph of what, for that basin, of whichever of those last three columns you're interested in. Or if you click the basin name, which I will do or did here to get this chart. On this slide, we see the status of the Snake River Basin. That was the one that had the highest percentage of the median peak, which you can see indicated by that green dot right in the center there of the image, about the 10th of April. Blue line is the maximum snow water equivalent for each day, while the red is the all-time minimum. And by all time, I mean going back to about 1980. The green line is the median snowpack, while that gray one shows last year's amounts. And then that black one that stops is for this year, where you can see that we're about 1.5 inches above the median and about 3.5 inches short of the median peak. And show one more here. The last one was the Snake, which was the highest. This is the Powder, which was one of our two low basins. Same color scheme. And you can see that a lot of the red line is missing and is gray instead. And that means that the snowpack last year in the Powder was tracking along the minimum, or actually it was below the minimum, and those values then became the new minimum. And this year, while better than last, we are still running well below the median, only halfway to the median peak. And all this currently does not bode well for water supply there, which, while still early in the season, is where we will go next. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron Fiaschetti with the USGS. He'll look at surface water conditions. Aaron?
Thanks, Tony. Hold on a second. I'm getting some feedback here. Oh, seems to be gone. Okay, so here we are today, middle of February, looking at current stream flow. If you look at the map here, this is real-time stream flow conditions from the National Water Information Dashboard. The green dots are what the USGS considers a normal stream flow. The 25th, which is a lower flow, to the 75th, which is a higher flow, will fall in that kind of green normal zone. So it's normal to be low, normal to be high. And then the red is a much below normal or all-time low. There's one site up in the park. The below normal would be orange. So that's below the 25th percentile. And then anything that's light blue is above normal, the 76th percentile. So right now, just taking a quick look at first glance, you say, well, everything looks normal and looks pretty good, except for a site up in the park, a site or two up in the park. But these are kind of taken with a grain of salt. Most of our sites aren't reporting. We're only showing about less than a third of our sites, and that has to do with either the sites are seasonal or the majority of the cases they're in ice, and ice disrupts the stage discharge relationship that we use to calculate stage, and we can't provide accurate real-time discharge information, so we can't report values. So the sites that are shown are generally somewhere up in a mountain area where the gradient's enough to kind of keep that ice buildup from occurring, or there's some sort of groundwater influence with some warmer water to keep the channel open, or it's below a reservoir. So that's kind of generally what's reporting values right now. So, and kind of looking at this map, it doesn't seem to really compare too well with the amount of drought reported in the state. And right now we're in a time of base flow where most of your water's coming from groundwater. So the amount of time it took that groundwater to express itself to the surface could be weeks or years or many, many years. So that affected drought might not always show up at a base flow, and base flows tend to be pretty low. So if you have a little bit of runoff that occurs because some warm weather, that can boost the flow just a little bit and make it seem like it's reporting a really good value when maybe it's just a little bit of water coming out of the system. So it's kind of a tough time of year to really make a good assessment of hydrologic conditions. But nonetheless, we'll go forward and take some bounce around the state. Next slide, please. So here you're looking at the Wind River above Red Creek near Du Bois. Kind of starting with the water year, flows have been kind of pretty low, right around that 25th percentile, and that kind of lines up pretty good with the drought conditions that have been in the area. But here around the beginning of February, it appears that there was some warmer weather in the area, and there was a bit of a bump in flow in that neck of the woods. So we'll kind of see how long that kind of persists. But you would expect that things would kind of trend down back towards the 25th percentile where it's been since the beginning of the water year. So we still got a bit of time before runoff starts in earnest there. Moving over to the Clear Creek near Buffalo, a tributary of the Powder. There's the little bit of missing record here, but you can kind of see starting at the beginning of the water year, things were close to the 25th percentile. And then in November, it kind of increased a little bit in October, and then took a pretty good dip in flow and into December, and then or into November. And then kind of since December, it's been hanging pretty close to the 75th percentile. So seems like flows have been pretty consistent there and looking pretty reasonable. So that missing record's kind of due to ice in the channel, and that'll be estimated by a technician here in the future. Moving down to the Deer Creek near Glen Rock. Yeah, things have been pretty low in that since the beginning of the water year, hanging in that 25th, even going to the 10th percentile, quite low flows there in November. A little bit of missing record in December, but things have kind of improved a little bit into January, but it's still quite low flows there near the 25th percentile, and probably will continue to trend there until some runoff starts to move out of that area. And then just moving over to the Snake River below Flat Creek near Jackson. This is below Jackson Lake, the reservoir. So that flow would be kind of controlled by releases out of that reservoir, but pretty similar conditions what we've seen at the last few sites. Starting the water year off with flows near or below the 25th percentile, kind of taking a bit of a dive into early December. And then here, kind of middle of January, things have kind of slowly ticked up at that site. And I really can't speak to exactly why that is, either a change in management or a little bit of runoff that might have occurred in that area. And then moving over to reservoirs, it's generally not a time of good water supply. Things are frozen up, so you'd kind of expect that reservoir levels wouldn't change very much, and they really didn't since we last met here. Most major reservoirs are kind of somewhere in that 50 to 80% full. The exception there would be Fontenelle. Fontenelle has been kind of decreasing in storage for the last few months, and I'm assuming that's just normal management to move water downstream to either downstream reservoirs and to make room for runoff. So with that, that's all I have, Tony. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. All right, let's continue on with surface water, and we have Liz Cresto with the Bureau of Reclamation to update us on reservoir ops. Liz?
Thanks. I'm with the Wyoming area office of the Bureau of Reclamation. So we cover reservoirs that are in the Bighorn Basin as well as in the North Platte. So starting off on the Bighorn Basin, we're delivering winter flows. These flows have been at these levels for quite some time and will continue throughout the winter. But Buffalo Bill, we're releasing 260 CFS, and that's measured at the river gauge. Bull Lake's at 25 CFS and Boisen's at 700 CFS. We don't anticipate increasing those flows until basically the start of the irrigation season. Next slide. In terms of reservoir contents, we're going off of a dry year, so our reservoirs are fairly low carryover. Buffalo Bill is 58% full. It's the lowest it's been since 2003. Bull Lake is 24% full and Boisen's 69% full. So we're thinking we're going to need average to above average spring runoff conditions in order to fill the reservoir. So switching over to the North Platte, we're also at winter flows on the North Platte, so fairly stable for the last several months. The Miracle Mile is at 530 CFS. Below Gray Reef, 500 CFS, and then we're pretty much shut off at Glendo and Guernsey. In terms of changes to outflows, we're looking at doing a flushing flow in the spring from Gray Reef. That might occur around March 17th through the 26th. Nothing is finalized at this point in time, so we'll get that information out via a water order as well as a news release when those plans are finalized. Next slide. In terms of reservoir contents, Seminoe's 48% full, Pathfinder's 57% full, and Glendo's 55% full. And so in order to get a full reservoir conditions, we definitely would need above average spring runoff. So we'll just be watching the snowpack and the rest of the snow accumulation season closely. So thank you.
Thanks, Liz. All right, looking to the future now with forecasts and outlooks. We have Lance Vandenbogert with the National Weather Service office up in Riverton. Go ahead, Lance.
All right, thanks, Tony. So let's go ahead and look at where we sit here as far as our typical Wyoming weather hazards. You can see mid to late February into mid to late March. We obviously have winter storms still occurring. We are solidly entering ice jam season, and we'll mention that here briefly. And a little early for some of our fire weather, but it can happen. And then high wind. We still have the jet stream cruising overhead, and we can a lot of times get high winds here in the winter season into the shoulder seasons. So if we look at the next week ahead, precipitation wise, snow is lingering across the Southwest. That's today into this evening. So that's the higher values you see there, over 1/10 of an inch of liquid in that snow. And then the West, you can see lots of blue colors there in the higher mountains. We are going to have another weather system move through, kind of more of just moisture in the westerly flow. That's going to put down some additional snow in the mountains of the West. But across the rest of the state, mostly dry there. That light green color is somewhat deceptive. That's less than 1/10 of an inch of moisture. So that's pretty light. We could get a little bit of precip across a lot of the basins in the central and east, but it's going to be very minimal. And then, so this is a precip slide, and I just put a little note there, and you're good to go there, Tony, on the next one. So we are concerned a little bit here about just the first pulse of spring warmth. Not major concerns, but for low elevations where we've been in the dead of winter for a while now, we are going to get up into the 50s east of the divide, probably some 40s in the higher elevation valleys in the west. What you're seeing there in that temperature graph is the hourly temperature forecast. That's for Sinks Canyon State Park, if you're familiar where that is. That's just a representative point. But what I wanted to show here is that as you move along that line, and right where Tony's cursor is there, that red line, that's the high temperature on Sunday, about 45, and then it drops down and it stays above freezing overnight into Monday. So whenever this happens, and you're going to have a couple of days of fairly warm temperatures, that low elevation snowpack where there's not usually, it's not like the whole mountain's melting off the snow, but there's maybe half an inch of moisture that suddenly goes into the rivers. You're going to probably see that reflected in the gauges that are operating, as far as that goes, and just ponding around people's houses and that sort of thing. It'll be the first hint that spring is not too far away. So just be aware of that. I've got a couple other graphics here to support that. So if we hop to the next slide, here's the overnight temperatures on that. This particular image here is for Sunday night into Monday morning. So anywhere you see overnight lows about 30 or above, which is much of this map, the blue color is not so much. So the bottom of the Bighorn Basin, the bottom of the Wind River Basin, it's going to be cold enough there. But it's kind of interesting that during these scenarios, it's actually the somewhat, not the bottom of the basin, but kind of the edges of the basin that stay kind of warm overnight, because the coldest air doesn't fill up right there. In places like Cody and Dubois, the foothills right above Lander, you can see that you're seeing those colors that indicate 30 to 35, maybe even a few places that are going to be right in those mid 30s. Well, that's kind of an indication for us to watch out. There could be some melting, and there's also going to be a little bit of breeze during this time frame for a lot of areas as well in the foothills, as we do have westerly flow. So just things to keep in mind here. I know normally we talk about the next month ahead. This is more near term, but since you might be seeing some of these impacts, it would be it's always smart of us to mention so you guys aren't surprised by something. So you'll see messaging coming from our office about that in the next few days here, about watch out, just a little bit of ponding of water, snow melt, minor flooding concerns. All right, so back to one more graphic here. This is actually the snowpack, so snow water equivalent, how much liquid is in the snow across the state of Wyoming. And the terrain, you can see a little bit there. The background map it doesn't pop quite as much as Google Maps terrain would. But you can tell where the mountains are, the greens, the purples. It's really more of the light blues that I'll draw your attention to, light blue to whitish colors in the northern Bighorn Basin. And then in some of the edges of the mountains, as Tony was showing there, Pinedale, those areas where probably not so much in the far western valleys there, because the temperatures they're going to drop below freezing overnight. but there is some snow coming down between Evanston and Rock Springs today. And then you have the northern Bighorn Basin between Cody and Lovell, north of Worland, where there is, 1 to maybe 2 inches of water in that snowpack. And they're going to be seeing probably 50s for multiple days as far as highs. And then overnight lows, as we just looked, in that 30, 35 range. And that's enough to start melting off that snow pretty quickly. So just be aware of that. All right, now I think we're going back to our regularly scheduled programming here. 8 to 14 day outlook. So the week after next, you can see a slight lean towards above normal temperatures for the eastern half of the state of Wyoming. And then for precipitation, most of the state has a slight lean towards above normal. Neither of those are very confident, though. They are pretty close to climatology being your best bet, but maybe just a slight lean based on the overall pattern. All right, and then we go a little bit further forward, look at the month of March. You can see that this gets more boring in some ways, but climatology is your best forecast here because there's not really a lean in the overall atmosphere and ocean system in the northern hemisphere to say, hey, we're leaning one way or another. So your 30-year average highs and lows, those are going to be your best bet, and your 30-year average precipitations over the course of that month are going to be your best bet at this time. And then we got our early spring outlook here. It's not an official term, just the March through May. We know in Wyoming that although that is meteorological spring, sometimes that feels a little bit like meteorological late winter, early spring for Wyoming. So on the left there, a little bit of blues pushing into the northern tier of the state. So a slight lean towards colder than normal, maybe for that late winter into early spring. And then for the other portion of the state, you can see below average dryness there. The southern 2/3 or so of the state is in that slightly below or a slight lean towards below normal precipitation. But again, not too strong of signal there. There's not a big, strong El Nino or La Nina signal that's showing up in these graphics. These take into account more than La Nina and El Nino, but that is a big factor. So, not a huge lean there. All right, and then with that, I'll pass back to you, Tony.
All right, thanks, Lance. So now to jump into water supply, we have Alex Carruthers with the National Weather Service's Missouri River Basin Forecast Center. All yours, Alex.
Thank you, Tony. So given the current mountain conditions that we just saw, the overall flood threat for Wyoming this melt season looks to be lower than normal. Likely the primary concern will be lower than normal runoff volumes for some locations. I should mention that both the NRCS and the National Weather Service produce these water supply outlooks, which represent the volume of water that's expected to pass a given gauging station during the spring and summer months. But we do use two different methods. The dots on this map indicate locations where water supply outlooks are produced from the National Weather Service. Official water supply outlooks are issued once a month near the beginning of the month, so the map that's currently being shown is valid as of the 1st of February. So what this map shows is the April through September volumes for the Columbia and Missouri River basins, and the April through July volumes for the Colorado River Basin. The point of this map is to show that many locations across Wyoming are forecasted to see only 50 to 90%, which are the oranges and yellow dots, 50 to 90% of the normal volume as compared to the 30-year average as of this February 1st forecast. However, as you guys have seen and experienced, there was a lot of recent snowfall. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. This slide here shows the unofficial water supply forecast valid as of yesterday, which does show some improvement, primarily in the Green River Basin, based on this recent snowfall that wasn't captured in that official forecast. This will, of course, be reflected in upcoming forecasts moving forward. Even with some of that recent snowfall, much of the state is still forecast to see below normal runoff this season, which would not be good for some of those reservoirs. Further detail on how these are produced can be answered by your respective RFC, which you guys are lucky in that there's 3 of them that work with your state. Northwest RFC, Colorado Basin RFC, and us, Missouri Basin RFC. That is all for me. Back to you, Tony.
Thanks, Alex. And now I will turn it back to Wendy, who will give us a brief update on the highlight of the month.
Great, thanks, Tony. So this month we had invited coalitions and collaboratives and NGO to present our highlight of the month, sharing about resources and efforts that they have for post-wildfire. And the reason we wanted to invite and highlight coalitions and collaboratives is thinking about the 2024 wildfires in Wyoming, and recognizing that oftentimes weather events post-wildfires, such as rain events and runoff, can result in compounding or cascading events. So that was our intent, was to highlight coalitions and collaboratives. And unfortunately, they're not able to present today. And I just want to share based off of an email that they sent. They shared that due to federal funding issues that coalitions and collaboratives post-fire work is funded by, and several of these agreements have been frozen and they were unable to present today. Their programs they were going to offer and share resources, several of them are in jeopardy. That being said, they are continuing to exist, and we think that their work is really important and their resources. And so we wanted to go ahead and share their slide deck, which they had put together prior to today and having their monies frozen. And so, Tony, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide. So just to briefly share, I was going to learn along with all of you about coalitions and collaboratives and their work. So I will not be presenting on behalf of them. What I do want to say is that they were established in 2014, and their roots can be traced back to 1996 following the Buffalo Creek fire in Jefferson County, Colorado, which resulted in significant flooding, and they realized the need for watershed protection. So from there, again, the coalitions and collaboratives didn't establish until 2014, but they can trace their roots back to that event in 1996. And go ahead and go to the next slide, Tony. One of their efforts is the After the Flames conference. And I found this really interesting and just kind of going through their slide deck, that the After the Flames conference brings together all levels of government, including local government, NGOs, among others, to have conversations around wildfire, post-wildfire, and community resiliency, as well as ecosystems. And the goals of this After the Flames event is to enhance community response and recovery after wildfires, and to strengthen post-fire response to reduce impacts, again, on communities and ecosystems. And if you go to the next slide, within their notes, they said really After the Flames conference is much more than just a conference. It includes workforce development and navigation, tools, resources, and training, and it's really community focused. So we can go ahead and skip down past a couple of more slides, Tony. You can move beyond that one. They did include a number of policy primer and overview in the next couple of slides, and I just want to note FEMA, DOI, US Forest Service, and other programs, other USDA programs that they've worked with. And I really can't speak to these, but I just wanted to make note of them, and because they'd included it within their slide deck. You can go on to the next slide. So after the fire conference, and you keep going. The next After the Fire conference is April of 2026. Go ahead and keep going. In Washington, you can see here on this slide here, so you can kind of stay tuned for this excellent conference and bringing together people to share and learn from one another, and hopefully being able to share additional resources there. Tony, go ahead and go to the next slide. And you can go on down. So I'll have Tony stop here in a few moments on a slide. Go ahead and go next. That we'll have, so Jonathan Bruno was going to be our presenter today, again with coalitions and collaboratives. And here's his contact information and their website. So if you're interested in learning more about this group and the work that they have done, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do into the future, feel free to check out their information. And as always, we will .pdf the slide deck so that and post it on the Wyoming Drought Information and Resources website so that you can look up Jonathan's information and the group's website if you need to track it down after today's webinar. So apologies that they were not able to present to you today so you could have a richer presentation than myself. That being said, we just wanted to make all of you aware that this effort is out there, this group doing some important work. So thank you, Tony, for going through those slides with me. And with that, here is the closing slide. You can see all the presenters' names, their affiliation, as well as their email addresses if you'd like to reach out to them after today's webinar. And I want to thank all of the attendees as well for joining us today. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop our recording